So our first church split, and what's going to set the stage for subsequent church splits would be the Great Schism. The Great Schism, the East-West Schism, the 1045 Schism. We know, and here you can see basically in about 1045 we get the split from the Western Church. The Roman Catholic Church would be the outcome of this, and the Eastern Church, Eastern Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, and all of those kinds of orthodoxy. We're going to lump them together. Yes, there are differences, but for our Western purposes, we're just going to lump them together as Eastern churches and the Roman Catholic Church as the Western Church. Does that make sense? Go ahead and ask questions if we have any problems. So now, what happened that caused the Great Schism, the East-West division? We're going to touch on few things that led to it. It's really hard when it comes to a historical event to put your finger on this is what caused that historical event. And what we can more see is causes that led to those events happening. For example, what caused World War II? Well, the Treaty of Versailles caused it. The rise of fascism, the rise of communism, the rise of Adolf Hitler, the Great Depression. All of those things led us to World War II. World War II didn't just, one day it wasn't happening and the next day it did happen. The same is true with those factors that led us to that. The Great Depression. What led us to the Great Depression? Well, Hoover's hands-off policy, deflation, the stock market crash, the New Deal, all of those things led us to the Great Depression. And so, the same way when we talk about the Great Schism, we're going to identify factors that led to the Great Schism. Interestingly, we do have a dramatic point that we can say that's when it happened. But in reality, it was building for centuries to get to the Great Schism. One of which would be the fall of Rome in the 5th century. The Roman Empire, under Constantine unifies the Roman Empire and becomes the first universal emperor of the Roman Empire. And as time goes on, you start to get a Western emperor and an Eastern emperor. And as time goes on, then both sides are facing pressures that the other side isn't facing. The Western Empire falls in the 5th century. They've expanded too far. They don't have enough money to pay their armies. The Goths, the Vangoths, and other barbarians are taking back their land. What was that?
Visigoth.
The Visigoths, all of those things lead to the fall of the Western Empire. The Eastern Empire, who we now call the Byzantine Empire, keeping in mind they didn't call themselves the Byzantine Empire, they called themselves the Roman Empire. We also start to get, at this point, Rome claiming the Pope's total supremacy over the entire church. We know that we had 5 bishops, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, Constantinople, and Rome. And those 5 bishops kind of were the top echelon in the church as we get into the 4th century, 5th century, 6th century. So we are centuries removed from the primitive church. And so that's why we as restorationists go, wait, what? What are you talking about? So it's about this time, though, with the fall of the West and so forth, that Rome, since where Rome is located in Italy, it still retains certain powers, certain authorities. And here, sometime, in the 500 years leading up to the schism, the Bishop of Rome starts to think of himself as the Pope, starts to think of himself as, I'm the guy who sits in Peter's throne, and because I sit in Peter's throne, all other bishops are below me. Whereas the Eastern bishops kind of look at that like, it's never been this way before, and we don't like this. We also start to get some theological differences between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. The first of these comes from the Nicene Creed. The Nicene Creed is the product of the Nicene Council in 325. The Nicene Council was called together to deal with the Arian controversy. We talked about Arius just a little bit earlier in this. Arius is the presbyter or the priest who's running around teaching Jesus isn't eternal God, he's a created being, he's a lesser God, or something of that nature. The church convenes at Nicaea in 325, and the Nicene Creed is the outcome of that. The Nicene Creed determines that Jesus is of one essence with the Father. But before we go beyond that, saying that Nicaea decided that, as though it had never been taught before that, or as though, New Testament Christianity doesn't teach the deity of Christ, I want to plug a book. It's called Reinventing Jesus. This comes from chapter 15. Chapter 15 is all about the Nicene Council. Current popular claims that Jesus' divinity was invented at Nicaea is a sign of our historical illiterate times. This is a very popular view. It was raised in the Da Vinci Code. You can find memes across Facebook and other social media saying that at Nicaea Jesus was promoted to God. Well, you guys have read the New Testament. You guys came to the conclusion that Jesus was God even before perhaps you ever read the Nicene Creed, right? And that's really a true statement there. Now, the West in 589 decides to change the wording of the Creed, and they do this without calling the East. How many of you have ever met with somebody, you've come to an agreement, a decision has been made, it's been ratified, it's been established, but then later that other party decides to change the agreement a little bit. And you go, I'm sorry, you can't do that. We had an agreement. You can't change that agreement later. Well, in 589, the West, I believe there in your notes I give you the wording of the Creed. The original creed began with, well, it didn't begin. I'm sorry. The part that we're dealing with, the creed, of course, has the repetitive statement, I believe in this, I believe in that. And it gets to the point, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, who with the Father and the Son is worshipped and glorified. Now, if you grew up, like I did, in the Western Church, the Catholic Church personally, but keep in mind this creed is also recited in Lutheran churches and other things, you heard that and went, wait, that's not right. He proceeds from the Father and the Son. Well, that's the change that the Western Church made in 589, changing the creed to He proceeds from the Father and the Son. This change is something that the Eastern Church always looked at going, no, you don't have the authority to change a creed that we already agreed on, and we're not going to accept this change that you decided without calling us up and talking about it again. Yes, I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek with church history here, but, we can do that. Another difference between East and West, use the English this morning. Another difference was celibacy of the clergy. In the East, and still to this day, lower clergy will define lower clergy as deacons and priests. By the time you get to bishop and the other steps above that, you do have to be celibate in the East. But in the East, a priest and a deacon, they can be married. Whereas in the West, the idea was that all clergy would be celibate. Now, it took a while for them to enforce that in the West, but it was one of those differences that once again, the West decides this, the East decides this, and they look at each other going, are we the same or are we different? This is all going to culminate. This is the point that we can say, here's where the schism was made official. Here's where it happened. And that would be the mutual excommunication in 1054. Michael Anybody want to try and pronounce that? Solar Arias, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it again. The Patriarch of Constantinople. Once again, I am just not using the English this morning. The Patriarch of Constantinople anathematizes the Pope. That's a big step to anathematize the Pope. Well, he only did that because the Pope excommunicated him. So you have the Pope saying, you're out, and you have the Patriarch of Constantinople saying, no, you're out. And so this is one of those moments that we can say the East said to the West, no, and the West said to the East, no. Keeping in mind that things had been building for centuries. Anathematize means to declare outside. It's similar to the word excommunicate, but it's the word used in Galatians when Paul is talking about those preaching another Jesus. Let them be anathematized. Let them be set outside. Let them be declared wrong. Let them be heretics. That kind of word.
A whole lot of meaning, kind of like Maranatha.
Now, all of this stuff happens at the political level. It happens at the high-ups church level. What's really going to touch the peasant, bring it down to everybody, is going to be the First Crusade. The First Crusade, Pope Urban II, he gets a message from the Greek Christians saying, we need help, can you help us? He, Pope Urban II, had been hoping to put the house back together. Let's reunify. And so I'm going to call upon British and European nobles to go help the Greek Christians. And that's going to be a bit of an olive branch. That's going to say, we're not so different. We can help each other out. The problem is when the Crusaders go, and they get there, they're not very nice. They're not very nice to the Greek Christians. And in fact, they continue not just helping Constantinople, but also the idea then to free Jerusalem, free the Holy Land. And we're going to go and we're going to kill the Muslims and so forth. But we're also not very nice to the Greek Christians. In fact, at one point, we drive the Patriarch of Jerusalem into exile, and he lives for the next he doesn't live, but the Patriarch of Jerusalem is exiled to Constantinople for the next 80 years. And we, the Western Christians, have gone over to the East and we've established Latin churches in the West. And we've put Latin priests and Latin bishops in those churches. You've got to admit you've been in places like this before, where you asked somebody for help, and when they came in, they didn't just help you, they took over. And their help was more burdensome than it was helpful. We've all been there, right? We can all agree to this. And so this, especially when somebody's rude to you, especially when somebody's violent to you, they're not seeing Eastern Christians as Christians. They're seeing Eastern Christians as people we have to convert to Latin Christianity. So that's really not going to help bridge the gap. And so the East and the West divide.